Welcome to another episode of Witty CFB. Your host, Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we are going to be discussing a Week 4 matchup between the James Madison Dukes versus North Carolina Tar Heels. Now, this, for me, is a interesting matchup for a couple of reasons. I think first, James Madison's one of those programs where they were an FCS powerhouse for a number of seasons before they made the transition to the FBS. They were mainly in the Sun Belt. They had a lot of success under Kurt Signetti, which he ultimately decided to take the Indiana job. Bob Chesney from Holy Cross comes in, and I think James Madison's a little bit of a rebuild right now. You have a number of things that really aren't going their way. You have Jordan McLeod, who decided to transfer to Texas State to be with J.G. Kenny. I mentioned losing Signetti to Indiana. They lost a number of players in the transfer portal as well. And, Bob Chesney, much like James Madison's history, Holy Cross has been one of the most dominant programs in the FCS, maybe not necessarily in terms of championships, but when you look at their progression in their history, for the most part, Holy Cross consistently been an 8 to 10 win program. And it's a very strong reason why Bob Chesney was chosen for this job. Now, the Dukes are in a little bit of a rebuild right now, but for the most part, they've played competitive. They've played pretty solid defense for the most part of the season, but the offense has really kind of been the fundamental issue, more or less. But the Dukes have averaged 174 yards rushing over the first couple games, and going into this North Carolina game, I think this is really going to be primarily a rushing attack game, because now flipping to North Carolina, the first thing that I noticed about North Carolina, they're starting their third quarterback now. So I previewed them last month, and one of the main things I really discussed last month was talking about how much they really need to rely on Omario Hampton to really get the rushing attack going and to open up some of those big plays that they are going to need in order to really contend in the ACC. So you have Max Johnson, who went out with I believe it was a torn ACL. Then you have Connor Harrell, who he, for the most part, struggled against NC Central and Charlotte. So I think the offense just looked a little bit lackluster. He didn't really look very comfortable. And it's not so much that they lost those games. It's more of just, I think the coaching staff felt that Jacolby Criswell was ultimately the next best option. But I also find it fascinating just in terms of the whole evolution of Criswell as well, which at least to me is one of the best storylines in all of college football this week. So for a little backstory on Criswell, he spent his first 3 seasons at he's a fifth-year senior, so he spent his first 3 seasons backing up the likes of Sam Howell and Drake Maye, who were both in the NFL now. And then, he back up for a little bit. He's only played about 267 snaps in his collegiate career, so I guess, yes, he is a veteran in a sense, but I think much like talking about Alex Orji over in Michigan, I think a lot of the question marks we're going to have around Criswell is to what extent is Mac Brown going to trust Criswell to be able to really throw across the field, or are we going to see more of what I think is going to be more of a conservative game plan, where it's going to be a lot relying on Hampton, and maybe you're going to see some quick throws, some easy reads, easy decisions. That way, when they get into the ACC games against Duke, against Pittsburgh, against all those teams, it'll be a little bit of an easier transition for them, assuming that everything there goes smooth. Now, with Criswell, I mean, yes, he's had an opportunity to show off a little bit, particularly kind of in the garbage time games where they're up by 2 or 3 possessions or whatever, and Criswell kind of can go out and show that he's the real deal. But for the most part, this is really going to be the first week where we're really going to see what Criswell really brings to the table in terms of getting the first team reps, in terms of how he's preparing for the game, in terms of how it's being structured and all of those things. Now, I'm not going to sit there and say that James Madison's a pushover team, because obviously I talked about their credibility being in the FCS before, and they've had a number of good seasons before. They're kind of in this sort of transition phase this year. But I think in general, if you're a North Carolina fan, I think this game could be a really great example of what North Carolina, I think of how North Carolina's offense is going to look different compared to, the likes of Harrell and Max Johnson. But I think this is also a great game for Criswell to be able to show up and really get the best version of himself because, in my opinion, if he's struggling against a team like James Madison, it could be a sign that yes, they are 4-0, but having that quarterback, controversy kind of linger over for the rest of the season. Now knowing that yes, they are undefeated, but at the same time, they've yet to play anyone in the ACC yet. So when you have those really conference games, and we're still kind of having the same conversation in terms of who should be starting at quarterback, I think it's only going to open up more questions for this program. Now, the thing about Criswell is from what I've seen of him, he's not exactly an elite runner. I mean, I do think for the most part, we're going to see a lot more quarterback designed runs where a lot of the plays that he was in, he had more rushing attempts than passing attempts. So I do anticipate North Carolina not really going away from that as much. But I think at the same time, you have to imagine, well, that play that Max Johnson got hurt on was something similar to that. So you have to wonder to what extent is Mac Brown and North Carolina's offensive staff really going to sit there and say letting Criswell take as many hits as they could, because when you have a couple decent wide receiver weapons. You Like I said, I've talked about Omari Hampton a lot on this program, especially in my opinion, he really is the best offensive weapon that you have. And they've been Minnesota, they've been Charlotte, they've been NC Central. So I mean, while Minnesota is a legitimate win, it's a legitimate power, P4 win, which is great and everything. But to me, if I'm looking a little bit further, I'm saying to myself, okay, the real test to me is going to be 2 weeks from now going to Pittsburgh. I mean, yes, you do play Duke, and they've played tough, but I think Duke and James Madison are kind of almost in the same boat, where Duke is transitioning outside of Riley Leonard. You have Manny Diaz taking over that program. They've played really tough and competitive. So I do think depending on how North Carolina looks this week, they could possibly go to Duke, start off 5-0, and then head to Pittsburgh and go from there. But just a couple stats just to kind of articulate what I think is going to be primarily a big rushing attack game, and what I also think is going to be a relatively low scoring game too. So I did mention that James Madison's rushing is averaging 174 yards of rushing per game, while North Carolina is averaging approximately 248 yards of rushing per game. So when you have that rushing attack already solidified, and you have James Madison who's essentially going to try to do the same thing, I I believe this game will ultimately be a fought in the trenches sort of game where if North Carolina can hold down the offensive line and can give enough space for Hampton to make some explosive plays, and for Criswell, I think really the expectation that you need to have is I think number one you got to just let him make some easy reads and really not overwhelm him too much, because yes, he is a veteran, but at the same time, you know, he's only taken 200 something snaps too, which in the grand scheme of things probably isn't really that many, considering a lot of those snaps were primarily in moments where, if he did make an interception or if he did fumble the ball, it's not really going to cause the outcome of the game. So I think this is really one of those moments for Criswell where it could really allow him to solidify winning the starting job officially from Connor Harrell. I think this is an opportunity to really see, like, what is North Carolina's identity going to be? Is it going to continue being with Omario Hampton, or is Mac Brown going to try to open up the offense a little bit more and trust Criswell to make those reads and to maybe find a little bit more of a balanced attack going into going into week 4 of the college football season. And I think more than anything else, the biggest thing for me when I'm watching this North Carolina game is I think you really just need to see that Criswell doesn't turn the ball over. And I know that a lot of people will criticize quarterbacks for being quote unquote game managers. I know that kind of gets a bad rap in terms of, oh, well, that just means he just doesn't turn interceptions and he maybe throws for 200 yards a game. And I don't, there's certain programs and certain situations where just not turning the ball over is completely sufficient. And when I look at this James Madison North Carolina game, yes, Criswell's a veteran in terms of being a fifth year senior, but he hasn't had the opportunity to really showcase his talents on a bigger stage like this, especially when he's had such a good comeback story between backing up in North Carolina, now being at Arkansas with under Sam Pittman for a season, and then coming back to North Carolina. I think this is really a coming home story for Criswell, and it really should be a really good way for him to continue to hopefully look poised and in command like he did in the NC Central game. And most importantly, if he can lead James Madison to a win, not turn the ball over, trust his weapons, allow Mario Hampton to get loose and explosive, and also be able to use your legs a little bit and keep the defense honest. This should be another example of North Carolina hopefully winning the game here and being able to go into ACC matchups continually be undefeated, and hopefully show more of this identity that they're continuing to build as they're going through what's now their third starting quarterback this season.